Sustainability. Some of you may know as SOGIS. I met Calestis, we found out today, in 1997 in October at a meeting at the National Academy of Sciences. And at that time, the meeting was called Nature and Human Society, I think, and there was just a real excitement about the conventional biological diversity that had been the 1992 Brazil, the Rio meetings. Out of that meeting came the conventional biological diversity and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And why this meeting was so memorable in 1997 is because at that time, Calestis was the executive secretary of the conventional biological diversity, raising biological diversity and what was happening to it in a big way. And he was very instrumental and very engaged in all aspects of it, from wildlife poaching to what you're going to hear about today. One of the things that I think is really remarkable about getting to know Calestis is that he has not only the facts, figures, and the data about Africa and what's happening with it, but he also has a great memory for the facts and how it can be applied for the future. And so with that, I'm just kind of going to stop and let Kathy Galvin, who's the director of the Africa Center, introduce Calestis.
Well, thanks for coming, everyone, and thanks for being here. It did take some effort to get Calestis here. We've been sort of after him for a year. So we're very, very thankful that he was able to join us today. Calestis is at Harvard University. He's professor of the practice of international development at the Kennedy School of Government and director of the Science, Technology, and Globalization Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He also directs the center's Agricultural Innovation Policy in Africa and the Health Innovation Policy in Africa projects, both funded by the Gates Foundation. He serves as faculty chair of the Edward S. Mason Fellows Program, as well as faculty chair of the Innovation for Economic Development and Technology, Innovation and Entrepreneurship in Africa executive programs. Dr. Juma is a former executive secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, as Diana just mentioned, and he's founding director of the Africa Center for Technology Studies in Nairobi. He co-chaired the African Union's high-level panel on science, technology, and innovation, and was on the jury of the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering. He's been elected to several scientific academies, including the Royal Society of London, the US Academy of Sciences, the World Academy of Sciences, the UK Academy of Engineering, and the African Academy of Sciences. He has won several international awards for his work on sustainable development. He holds a doctorate in science and technology policy studies and has written widely on science, technology, and environment. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Juma to CSU.
Thank you both for the very kind introduction. I spent a great 2 days here and got a practical present I thought I should actually use for my talk. I never get anything I don't put into practice immediately. So it's not very practical right now. It's a little dark. Thank you for the glasses. I'm going to wear them on the plane back. I actually have a proposal for you, which is that you have a great audience tonight. Why don't we just declare the talk a success and then go and have a reception or something like that? I'm delighted to be here, partly because of the idea that you do have here at CSU a new center on African studies that can actually help to work in a way that reflects contemporary Africa. So a lot of a lot is happening on the continent. And what I really wanted to share with you is some of my own thinking about where African agriculture might be headed, both in light of opportunities on the continent at the moment, growing interest in investing in African agriculture, but also being able to connect with concerns about ecological management, conservation of biological diversity. Basically, the potential transition towards sustainable agriculture. Let me start with a caveat. I'm going to be using the word Africa, but I'm also conscious of the fact that Africa is a fairly large continent, very diverse, and so do forgive me if I appear to be suggesting that Africa is a country. I get reminded all the time on Twitter, particularly by my UK colleagues, that Calestas, Africa is not a country. And I say, please tell me more. It's big enough. You can fit in there the United States, China, Western Europe, India, Argentina, and have sufficient room to sneak in Britain. So another way of thinking about the size of the continent is it's 3 times bigger than the United States minus Alaska. So it's a fairly large place. And this also explains both some of the challenges that the continent faces, but also the opportunities that are associated with having just a great variety on the continent where you can experiment with different ideas in different places and then explore ways by which people can learn from each other. So that's a great benefit in terms of experimentation. A huge challenge in terms of infrastructure and connectivity. And I'm happy to chat a little bit about that in the period of Q&A. But I wanted to go back to just a bit of my own background. These are 2 books I published the same year in 1989. One was exploring the potential of using biological diversity as a foundation for agricultural transformation. So I spent a bit of time looking at particularly Kenya's use of indigenous vegetables and crops. And then at the same time, it was the early days of the beginnings of advances in genetic engineering. So I was starting to explore ways by which you could bring ecology and botany on the one hand, and molecular biology and genetics, advances in genetics on the other. That I thought that these 2 fields actually belong together, that they would be over time complementary. But what seems to have happened over the last 20 years or so is that these fields have grown apart. And what I want to argue is that there is now an opportunity to actually bring them back together, partly because of greater awareness on the importance of nutrition in agriculture, the connection between nutrition and agriculture on one hand, but also in terms of greater understanding of the genetic endowment of the African continent, basically as a result of advances in science and technology on one hand, but also just diagnostic tools that allow scientists to be able to map genetic diversity at different levels, whether it's microbial, soil microbe, all the way to the genetics of trees. So that's what I really wanted to explore a little bit, which is the potential of bringing back these 2 fields after a couple of decades of a kind of divergent growth. And I was inspired mostly by thinking about just the diversity of crops that are consumed worldwide. It's estimated that roughly 50,000 different plants are consumed in some part of the world, and yet only 3 of them account for close to 75% of the calorific intake of the global human population. And how we got there was essentially at the expense of this huge endowment of genetic resources that could be leveraged for African agriculture. And I usually do a quiz of where different crops originate. And I was advised by my colleagues that when you go to Colorado, you can do a quiz, but don't mention hemp. So I decided I'm not going to do a quiz, because whenever I've done this quiz, I've always included hemp. And every time I mention hemp, people think it's from Jamaica. So, which it isn't. And there's a kind of a resurgence of interest in diversity of genetic resources, mostly driven by this new concern over nutrition, but also guided very much by advances in scientific knowledge. So 4 or 5 years ago, I put together a book in response to a famine in the Horn of Africa, basically exploring this idea that Africa could feed itself in a generation. And in fact, my motivation for putting this argument forward was the potential of leveraging these diverse crops that are consumed across Africa, but in pockets of populations. They have not been the subject of large-scale support for research. That's what one of my motivation for writing the book was essentially that opportunity that we can actually change African agriculture. I launched it in the company of 5 East African presidents. The launch was hosted by the president of Tanzania. You can see they are really happy to receive the book. It was an extraordinary event because they were launching a book whose contents they hadn't seen. And they had to trust me that the book did not contain insults of presidents. So each one of them, I had only 10 copies. The book hadn't actually been released by the publishers. I had only 10 copies. And each of the presidents gave a copy to their special assistants to read very quickly through whether it was legitimate to launch it. And we're sitting there waiting, thinking, no, this is just a typical lateness that people are accustomed to, but it's because the special assistants were quickly reading through it. But you notice the title of the event. That was picked very carefully by the president of Tanzania, which was food security and climate change. They're starting to observe that the changes in the environment, whether it was influenced by climate change or just regional ecological variations, were starting to have implications for food security, which presidents needed to be aware of because of the consequences of food insecurity for broader national security. We launched the book. We just released a second edition of the book. And that coincided with a great interest in Africa, which is a continent that's 11% of the world population, but roughly between 50 and 60% of the arable land available worldwide is on the African continent. So this is the one region which is likely to experience great focus on expanding agricultural production, not just to feed the continent itself, but to feed the rest of the world as well, or parts of the rest of the world. Currently, Africa imports somewhere in the neighborhood of 83% of its food, so heavily dependent on imports. 20 years ago, Africa used to be a net exporter of food. It's now a net importer of food. In fact, Africa exports less food than Thailand exports. Just a sense of comparison. And so our argument is that with this potential, maybe the time has come to think about doing agriculture differently, not just pursuing the same old models that have worked elsewhere, and assuming that those would be the ideal models for African countries, which is basically getting back to sustainable agriculture as the way forward. And my view of sustainable agriculture includes the ability to leverage this decentralized, diverse crops that are grown across the continent that could become part of the food basket. The trends in conventional crops have not been very encouraging. The Africa produces, the yields are very low, roughly 1/10 of the yields in the United States. And so a lot of effort is going into figuring out how to raise yields. And you find this across the board, not just in corn. You find it in peanuts, which is a major staple in Senegal. You can see that in the 60s, 65, today's yields in Senegal are lower than what they were in 1965. Part of it is basically changes in soil structure, depletion of nutrients, loss of productive capabilities, whereas peanut production elsewhere has grown quite significantly in terms of yields. So it gives you just an idea of what the challenges are. Same story with bananas in Tanzania, big increase initially and then a significant decline in yields. But what's interesting, this is an instructive slide, which is one area where we've seen an increase in yields is in Ethiopia in sorghums. And the main reason there is that because sorghums are indigenous to Africa, Ethiopian scientists have had a great access to diversity within the species, which they have been able to use for breeding and adapting it to different ecological conditions across Ethiopia. So it's an example of where if you leverage domestic genetic material that is diverse, you have greater possibility for new combinations to increase yield. So my claim is that was put into indigenous African crops, you'll have much greater potential for expanding yields, but also you will have very happy consumers. Africans resonate very positively with their traditional crops. And so every time donor agents have done surveys in Africa of what they thought, asked about the priorities of Africans in crop production, they always, in most cases, the Africans would list their indigenous crops at the top of the list. And this is not something that donors usually like to see because they have familiarity with investing in those particular areas. So they generally don't get funded. And so that got me thinking, especially like how do you go about doing it? And there's some interesting work that has been done. This a process actually initiated by the late Norman Borlaug, who did in 1996 worked on the production of this first volume of just a selected number of cereals that are consumed across Africa. It's a very small sample that indicated what was actually possible. And that was followed by the 2 volumes on vegetables. The first volume, but I was part of the 2 volumes, which again was probably one of the last major works that Norman Borlaug actually oversaw, because he was very convinced that this offered a great possibility for Africa to have a new beginning in defining its own agricultural revolution, as it were, instead of this idea of importing revolutions from elsewhere. Africa could build on biological resources and create new farming systems. That work is really, for me, it's the most important challenge for African agriculture today. Not just African agriculture, but also thinking about global agriculture, in that it would help to recruit new crops and new sources of food into the global system that would diversify the global basket. These are just a couple of examples of some of my favorite plant that's actually quite widely grown in Africa, Sabacomorensis, which is a fruit tree in the parts of Western Kenya where I was doing some research in the late 80s. Every time you mentioned it, there are some places where it was lost and they only preserved in local song. And whenever you mentioned it, people went into a song. And the song was basically the carrier of the knowledge surrounding that plant. And we didn't know what it looked like, but the descriptions gave us an idea. We looked around and we found out that it existed on the Ugandan and Tanzanian side of Lake Victoria. And the challenge was basically being able to breed it and adapt it to different ecological conditions. It grew it's a vine and grew mostly along rivers. the rest are probably known to some of you. The big opportunity that I've been exploring is this area of advances in the sequencing of genomes. That this is just made possible to have access to genomic information that can now be used to help in new breeding programs. And I'm not talking about the classical genetic engineering of moving crop genes across different species. I'm just talking about functional genomics, of just being able to understand better the genetic characteristics of these indigenous crops. And this was not possible before. You couldn't even justify it. I remember, is this on record? Is anybody tweeting today? I remember at a meeting of the African Academy of Sciences, and I mentioned something about Africa's indigenous crops, and the CEO of one of the major American grain companies said, I was talking too much about these vegetables and fruits, and he said, you are just emotionally attached to your traditional crops. And I said, yeah, I think you are also emotionally attached to corn. And it involved some mediation by the coordinators of the meeting. Otherwise, this meeting wasn't going to end very well. But now it's really a different story. We are down to close to being able to sequence a genome at the cost of $1,000 in literally a number of hours. And the possibilities for sequencing genomes of crops have significantly expanded. For example, when sequencing of the human genome becomes part of the regular diagnosis in hospitals, you go to see your doctor, and the first thing they do is they spend an hour sequencing your genome. I started to think that's a great moment to bring your seeds as well. So when they're sequencing your genome, they can also sequence your seeds from your community, and then you can go back to the CD with your DNA sequenced and also your crop genome. And some of these machines, like the one from Illumina, can sequence up to 80 genomes at the same time. So there's no lack of capability for sequencing of genomes. I had a conversation with a colleague who was just stepped down recently from the BGI, the Beijing Genomics Institute. And he just said, look, we can do this for free. Any African doing it for free for some institutions. So this just gives you this new opportunity to revisit these traditional crops and have a better understanding of their genetic attributes, nutritional content, agronomic potential in terms of being able to breed them and adapt them to different conditions. And it's being done. This is God intervened. This is a project run by God out of Kenya. It's a team that is sequencing the genome orphan crops. That's the term used for it. That's how Shapiro of Mars Corporation. Some of you know him. People used to call him Santa Claus, and I was comfortable with him being called Santa Claus until he decided to play God, which is to sequence genomes. And at that point, I decided he was no longer just Santa Claus. He's God. But he's run these workshops now, four of them out of East Africa, and basically sequencing the genomes and making them available, the data sets available to Africans to actually work on figuring out what the sequences can do. And that's a great opportunity to build up new partnerships in functional genomics. In that the biggest challenge before was sequencing them. That is no longer the problem. In fact, the task of functional genomics is a human resource question. So I've been working with a number of African countries to get this functional genomics to become a standard part of undergraduate training in African universities. In fact, some of it can be done by high school kids anyway. But this gives you an indication of what could be done where the entry barriers are very low. You can do things which you couldn't do in the past, which is have a better understanding of the genetic characteristics of these various diverse crops. And then we have the new frontier, which is gene editing possibilities. Again, very, very low entry barriers. If you take, say, CRISPR-Cas9, with $100, you can put together a kit that can help African universities get engaged, particularly in the area of crops. And the reason why this is of interest to me was when we did the two previous volumes of the National Academy of Sciences, there were a number of reasons given by the contributors to the volume as to why these crops were not widely being utilized. They included just lack of knowledge on the agronomic practices. People could harvest it in the wild, but they didn't know how to germinate them. They didn't know how to propagate them. There were issues that had to do with the susceptibility to pests. Some of them, so you needed to consume them as soon as you harvested them. Otherwise, the pests got there before you did. And so being able to figure out how to control the pests, learn a bit more about how to propagate them. And then a third one was shelf life. Many of them had very short shelf lives, especially vegetables. So if you could figure out a way of just breeding programs that could help to extend the shelf life, you would have, you broaden the market for it. A fourth one was just lack of knowledge on how you process the products. Again, there's greater knowledge now on food processing than there was, say, 20 years ago. And so you can also start to think about ways by which you can select for different traits. This is one of my favorite examples of what we've done with the wild mustard. Can you do the same with these vegetables, indigenous vegetables? In fact, it's been done extensively with amaranth, which is selected in some places for seed, in other places for the leaves. So the same breeding interventions could be done for a lot of different crops, which would then increase the diversity of those crops, increase the potential creation of new markets for the actual use. And also includes dealing with other issues like land tenure, for example. This is aerial yam that is grown quite extensively on the slopes of Mount Elgon. I identified it when I was doing some research there. And farmers liked it. I noticed that the farmers that had very little land preferred to have aerial yams because it's a vertical crop as opposed to being horizontal. Same nutritional content as potatoes. And so you can start to get into crops like that tend to address new concerns. I was thinking if you did this, you could then start to grow this in your own house anyway through using hydroponics, for example. And that area of tree crops, this is a vine, but when you start to get into the area of tree crops, again, you start to identify new possibilities that also help to deal with the, say, climate variability. An example of that is breadfruit, which is now being basically from the Pacific. There's a great facility in Hawaii, the National Tropical Botanical Garden, which has been run by Dan Reagan for almost 30 years. It's collected like 250 different varieties of breadfruit that is now being sold in Africa. Again, the most interesting part of it is land use. You know, it's a tree crop, it's vertical, very little need for agricultural inputs, and the tree starts fruiting after 4 to 5 years and lasts between 50 and 70 years. There are very few crops that have similar characteristics. It's just another way of thinking about how to expand the food basket by leveraging genetic resources, biological diversity, in this case, moving into the area of tree crops. And you can different ways. You're completely short of land. These are approaches that are being used in Africa now to grow all sorts of vegetables. You can donate your old plants to African countries. They become a farmland. People are very creative in the way they use resources. And this is a little story that, not a little story, but an article that appeared in Nature magazine recently, on June 9th, written by, in fact, a resident of Colorado. The reporter who wrote this story lives in Denver. And she visited Kenya and was really surprised to find, one, a vibrant research program in one of the Kenyan universities, Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology, that is basically breeding, conserving, and propagating indigenous. And the fact that there's no policy focus on it, there's not going to this field. And it's happening in of universities, basically driven by passion, interest, and cultural affiliation to tradition. Despite all the challenges we see, African researchers, popular opinion, work on this. They're making them, these crops are making to the market. There are markets that are just devoted to selling traditional crops. So there's a whole new effort to revive and propagate these crops that makes it hard to think of them as lost crops anymore. And to me, that's a foundation that's really important to build on, which is that it's happening in universities. So they're becoming a basis for scientific research. And then through universities, they're being propagated to communities around universities. And that got me thinking that get university networks that start to focus more on how to leverage the world's biological resources to expand the food base. And in this case, Africa might be a very interesting place to actually start. And that's a challenge I would like to offer to CSU, that this could be an opening of bringing conservation and sustainable use of biological resources back together, where there's a motivation of the obvious economic benefits, which is basically getting this to the marketplace. And the fascination with it at the moment is kind of a fad in some places, but actually creates a real possibility to raise awareness about crops that may have been taken for granted in the past. The interest in improving nutrition is another entry point. And the third one is purely academic one, which is that, in my view, the best way to introduce genetics or crop genomics in an African setting is to ask young people to sequence their own traditional crops. You can't get a better source of motivation than that. So there are a lot of reasons you could basically use to advance this new area, which helps to bring together conservation and food security. So at this point, I think I'd like to stop here, and I promised that I would answer some questions. So I'm open to questions. If I don't have the answer, I will just tell you, sorry, I can't answer that.
Thank you. So I have two questions. But basically, I worked in Senegal with a youth permaculture group, and one of the projects we're doing is to start an agroecology center. And it's a very sort of small local initiative, but it's, so I was talking about this initiative when I was in DC with some NGOs, and they were talking about how the World Bank is about to do this big investment in Senegal in agroecology, but what they were going to promote was marigolds to be exported to Europe or something like that, which I was pretty horrified about, but they tried to explain how, these farmers who aren't making any money because of different issues with their crops, this is going to give them the opportunity to make some money through exporting marigolds. And I just wanted to, first question is to hear your opinion on what you think of this method of yet promoting this method of doing agroecology, and if you think there's room for it in the space of trying to promote food security when farmers might not be able to be making money from the crops they're growing. And then my second question is, what advice do you have for these sort of smaller grassroots organizations that do want to do sort of a lot of the work that you're talking about, but have, it seems that most people don't want to invest in anything unless it's a big project?
Yeah, I think one is, on your first one with agroecology and World Bank, I don't want to get into bashing the World Bank, but it's not uncommon to see whenever an idea, a new idea comes up. Agroecology is like a new idea now, everybody's talking about it. And the bank and other institutions say, oh, that might be a place where we might want to be involved. Remember, it's called the World Bank. It's a bank. This is something that people actually forget. Many Africans think that the World Bank is a development agency out to help them. No, it's an investment institution to make money for itself. And one of the byproducts, if you're lucky, will be development. So most of my work has been in the last 10 years, it's been with the African Union. And the reason why I've been working with the African Union is to try to get to universities, because many of these issues have a lot to do with how you take knowledge and transform it into goods and services. And so they may be very small operations in many places, but they provide a different kind of starting point of how you might support communities. I'll give you my favorite example. It's a small Boston-based NGO that went into Western Uganda almost 20 years ago and started to train young women. This is an area that had been heavily affected by the Idi Amin, the war against Idi Amin, and all the men were dead or in prison. And there were this group of young women between 12 and 15 who basically were trying to figure out how to basically support themselves. This NGO started offering them training programs, and the women would define what they needed to be trained in. And after they did this for 3 successive years, the person who was helping them realized that the curriculum they asked for was similar to what was being offered at Makerere University in agriculture. These are young women between 16 and 12 and 16. They had reinvented basically undergraduate training. This institution now exists as the African Rural University for Women. It's Africa's first university devoted to training women in agriculture. And it has a radio station, it sells its products. The radio station broadcasts agricultural information, not just to the students, but to the community around. This is a very different model from the one where a large institution like the World Bank comes in and says, we will help you, but please export to the European market. So my answer to your question is that because of the size of the continent, there are so many options to do things differently. And there are so many other models that actually work, where, as you can see, this was the first NGO, it's the first NGO I've come across in Africa that has incubated a university. When you think of university, you think that usually governments that incubate universities. So even small organizations, if they focus on the view that it's the knowledge that is important, they can start to do things that are very, very different, that will be very supportive of local communities, will generate income, will have greater support from government. I mean, the leadership of Uganda has been to visit this university several times because it's a different way of thinking about the role of technical education and development. And so there's this term that gets used a lot, social entrepreneurship, and I'm sure some of you are probably building social enterprises. And I would urge you to, if you are thinking along those lines, to think about these enterprises as just bundles of knowledge. And that the purpose of bundling that knowledge is to turn it into goods and services. And that starts to select for different kinds of partners. It starts to select for, say, like universities as partners. And that's a very different approach from the one the World Bank uses, which historically has always stayed away from funding institutions of higher learning. So if you go to them and say, we are building a small NGO and hopefully one day it will incubate a university, they will not talk to you. Yes?
Yeah, so, your title and the topic is biodiversity and growing food for Africa. And so if we look at people like Borlaug and what he did, we have all these different crops that are in different areas that are used, but you might call them domesticated but not improved, right? So is there an effort like what Borlaug did that had such a huge impact on humanity and available food, is to go after all of these small, more local vegetables, trees, whatever agricultural product, and to take advantage of the biodiversity and select for attributes that increase yields or increase yields under low inputs and things like that. Is there much of an effort on that?
It's interesting that local people are doing it themselves without the help of large institutions. I use this as a spider flower. This is like the queen of vegetables in Eastern Africa. And I was surprised talking to local women who are growing that they would go to Kenya's the nearest agricultural research station for training, which was training them how to breed corn, beans, and other onions and other crops. And they would diligently go and spend weeks there being trained. But then when they went back home, they started applying those same techniques to their indigenous vegetables. So that got me thinking that the issue here is instead of taking the farmers to the knowledge, could you turn this around and say, let's bring the knowledge to the farmers? So that homesteads and farms, smallholder farms, could be part of an extension system of a local research institute.
And is that in fact taking place? Because I think that's going to have a greater impact on yield and nutritional value than CRISPR-Cas9. Okay, CRISPR-Cas9 is for something you know a lot about that you want to change.
Yes, this is the way to do this is to decentralize the systems of higher education so that higher education and research, so that these institutes can be closer to the farmers. And I was actually in Ethiopia a couple of weeks ago talking to African ministers of education, science and technology with a proposal exactly along these lines and saying for every agroecological zone in your country, there is some research institute that will be created to do research, but it's not connected to farmers. How about creating a partnership with the farmers so that the farmers help you to figure out what the priorities might actually be? And we found, I put this forward as a proposal, and many of the ministers came to me giving me examples that they're already doing exactly this in their countries, in Uganda, even in South Sudan, which is going through chaos at the moment. They have similar programs. But it's not being done as part of a national strategy. It's being done because somebody nearby got interested and then started working with farmers. So what I'm working on is actually have this become part of the national strategy of these countries. But it's happening a lot on a very small scale. And it's driven by a few institutional entrepreneurs who are doing it, but it's not supported as part of public policy. So my push is that it should be part of public policy and not just left as ad hoc activities driven by a few interested individuals. But there's no shortage of experiments along those lines. There are lots and lots of examples of people doing this. This lady that I mentioned, where Mary Abukoso, who is working at the Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology, she's partnering with the women farmers. So most of her ideas on the vegetables she's growing and breeding at the university are actually coming from farmers. Yes.
So sounds a lot like cooperative extension, doesn't it?
It's funny you say that. I used to go around Africa saying Africa just needs something like the land-grant colleges. And then it turned out that there are some people who really hate land-grant colleges. And so I went back to the ministers last month, and I said, call them innovation universities, and say, yeah. But it is just land-grant colleges.
So I do have a question, though.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak to the role that political instability has played in the decrease in production, agricultural production in Africa. You said it used to be a net exporter and no longer is, and I can think of at least one country that used to be much more productive than it is now. Maybe during that time when they were exporting. So just curious about your thoughts about that.
Yes, I think that there are two kinds of political instability. One is chaos, political chaos, and some ideology that drives how leaders think about the future of their countries. And an example of that is Zimbabwe, which basically wrecked its agriculture completely. And even though they don't think they did that. So that's one type, and that has affected a number of countries. The other one is just conflict. And this is we saw it in Kenya. We had a post-election violence. This debate was going on among the leaders, fighting over who is going to get with which ministry, when Kofi Annan was negotiating, helping them to reach agreement. And I called up one of the ministers and I said, I've looked at satellite imagery, compared the farmland in the Rift Valley now with exactly the same time last year. There are no farmers on the farms now. There are a lot of farmers working, there are tractors. There are no tractors, there are no trucks, there's nothing. You're going to have a famine. And the minister says, we better factor this into negotiations. Because they're not connecting conflict with production. And so if you're killing farmers, you really have some issues with how you're thinking about the future. It's not a surprise that Kenya had a famine soon after that. And so conflict is a big challenge, particularly for crops. Because for livestock, you can have conflict and people can move with their cattle. Crops just stand there. Crops don't run away. And that's a real problem for agriculture. As you've seen wherever, it's not even the conflict, but the perception of conflict. The expectation that there might be a conflict, people decide not to farm. And it's really catastrophic because if you kept, particularly for communities that keep seed, you keep seed for a year and then you don't farm. What happens the following year? They eat the seed. And then the year after that, they have nothing to grow. This happened in Angola over and over again. And so I think I have been my argument that peace actually is Africa's most important common currency to work on is peace first, and then everything else will actually follow. And you find it's happening in Eastern Congo, same kinds of questions. But this is not what explains the decline. Zimbabwe is a big part of that decline, but part of it's been just expansion in population, significant expansion in population, urbanization has been a big part of it, and just a shift in some areas, not a shift, but a decline in productivity in a lot of Africa that has forced farmers, a lot of people just to abandon agricultural production. Yes.
What's your view of the role, of many roles of the UN in facilitating the kind of programs, your model in Africa?
I used to work for the UN and spend a lot of time working with the UN. The UN is really very good at convening. If you want to get people together to talk about something, the UN is a very effective mechanism for doing that. When it comes to actually getting something done, the UN is not very effective. And I was working in the UN.